Prior to 2020, there was growing awareness of the impact of single-use plastics. There was sort of this infamous video of a sea turtle with a straw inside of its nose that led to a lot of single-use plastic bans. But then, we had COVID and we suddenly had to use a lot of single-use plastic.
Not all plastics are made equal, and some types of plastics have a need in society, and we require them for modern life. What's important is that we improve the type of plastics that we work with or that we use, and rather regulate those that are unnecessary and that do not have a good potential of being recycled.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. Okay, so we know about plastic pollution. It's in our oceans, it's clogging up rivers, marring our beaches, and collecting on mountains, basically found almost everywhere in our environment. In fact, last month, countries came together in Busan, South Korea, to debate a new global treaty to limit the harms of plastics, but they failed to reach an agreement. So it seems if decision makers are not that concerned, why should you be? Well, here's one good reason. Aside from plastics polluting your surroundings, they're also accumulating in your body. And studies have found that plastics in human blood and brain matter could have devastating consequences. So why is so little being done about plastic pollution, and why doesn't the world seem to care? Well, for this discussion in Amsterdam, we're joined by Irene Hofmeijer from Earth Action, who was at that Busan Treaty negotiations and has worked for years reducing plastic waste, from starting a cleanup organization in Peru to working in Taiwan at a circular design firm. And joining us from London, we have Maynard, our environmental contributor and an environmental consultant. Thank you both for being part of the program. I'm going to start with you, Irene, and I want you to give us a sense of the type of plastic pollution the world is dealing with now. Why should we care?
Yeah, it's a great question, Divya. Why should we care? And I think the main thing to keep in mind is that plastic pollution is everywhere. Like you well said, it's everywhere in the environment. But more importantly, we're also beginning to have evidence that plastic is in every single one of the human body organs. There was a recent research showing how it's permeated the least permeable part of our body, which is our brains. At the end of the day, plastic is a derivative from petrochemical, and having such a chemical material slowly accumulating in our bodies can become a future human health threat.
Definitely something to worry about. Nate, where do you think we are in the plastic pollution scenario in the world?
I think we're not doing well. There was a lot of momentum, prior to 2020. There was growing awareness of the impact of single-use plastics. There was sort of this infamous video of a sea turtle with a straw inside of its nose that led to a lot of single-use plastic bans. But then, we had COVID and we suddenly had to use a lot of single-use plastic. I know in Taiwan that caused a shift in priorities, along with many other countries moving away from circular economy and reducing plastics. So right now, plastic production continues to increase. It shows no real sign of stopping, and the statistics about plastic going to the ocean is quite dire. So we really need to take action, and there's growing global consensus that we have to do something.
Right, the consensus is there, but the action, well, that's another question. But before we go further, I want us to take a look at what happens to plastic packaging once we throw it out. Now, despite decades of campaigns promoting recycling or reuse of plastics, the vast majority of plastic packaging still ends up in landfills and garbage dumps. Around 14% of it is burnt, which is also roughly the percentage that gets recycled. But even in that category, some of it is lost in the process. And alarmingly, a good chunk of waste ends up in the oceans, as we've been talking about. Now, Irene, we've been talking about recycling for years now, and this whole idea of, yes, sure, we can use plastic, we can always throw it in recycling, and then everything will be fine. Why is that really wildly untrue?
Yeah, so to start with, we have to remember that the plastic pollution problem is not just a garbage problem. It's not just the fact that it's accumulating in the natural environment, that we see plastic in our oceans and in our natural spaces. It's also the fact that plastic is a man-made material that is a mix of an oil-derived product with a bunch of chemical additives. So what we're increasingly seeing in the science is that plastic causes harm at every single stage of the life cycle. And going back to the treaty, this is one of the issues that was most contentious in Busan, is that there was a group of countries that only wanted to focus on the plastic pollution problem as a waste management problem, whilst the grand majority of countries were actually looking to develop global regulation of the full life cycle of plastic. So that is to take into consideration the thousands of harmful chemicals that are added to the manufacturing process of plastics, and that we have increasing evidence that are posing problems not to just environmental health, but also human health. So going back to the recycling question, recycling can help the end of life, that is to say, the physical pollution problem and avoiding plastic accumulating in the environment. And yes, we need to increase recycling rates. We need to improve plastic waste management. But overall, we also need to reduce the volume of plastics that we're putting on the market. As Nate well said, we see that production numbers are only increasing. And we also see that the types and variety in chemical mixes are also only increasing. So we're making these mixes that we have no idea what it means in the future when it comes to human health.
And Nate, plastic is not just about the physical plastic. Let's talk about carbon emissions here. How does that contribute to the overall kind of climate change greenhouse effect?
Yeah, plastics have an interesting relationship with carbon. They are made of petrochemicals, right? They're drilled, processed, you use naphtha cracking facilities, you break down, a barrel of oil into its different components, and you make different types of plastic. So we have huge carbon emissions there. You need these petrochemical facilities, which, by the way, have really serious human health effects as well. If we talk about the largest petrochemical complex in the US, which is, unfortunately referred to as Cancer Alley by activists, it's in Louisiana. You have 50 times the cancer rate of the US national average for communities living there. But, going back to the carbon element, plastic also has a challenging aspect in that it can help with the lightweighting of products. So some products that might be transported using metal or a heavier material can be transported with plastic, but then plastic also can contaminate recycling streams. So sometimes plastics can help us reduce carbon emissions, but it's causing human health, biodiversity, and air quality impacts. Other times it can just be causing more carbon emissions.
So let's go back to the conversations at Busan, Irene. You talked about how there might be a certain disconnect with what some countries wanted and what others wanted. But was there a general conversation on stopping the use of plastics or drastically reducing it?
I think in your opening, Divya, you mentioned how the treaty failed, and indeed we were not able to achieve a treaty in Busan. But I like to think that we did make a step forward, most of all because it didn't fully stop. This was the fifth session of negotiations. We've been having these meetings for 2 years now, and we were hoping that in this fifth session an agreement would be reached. What instead was reached was an agreement to postpone and to have a follow-up session in before June of next year. So there is still hope. We still have an opportunity to reach a treaty. And the reason why I'm also hopeful is that we did see a vast majority of countries agreeing on some of the most contentious issues, and one being the regulation of chemicals of concern. So the issue that I was speaking to, and to the fact that plastics is not just the petrochemical derivatives, but these chemical mixes and additives that are added to have different material qualities to the plastic product. So there was over 80 countries that agreed on the need of regulating chemicals of concern, and there was close to 100 countries that were agreeing on a more ambitious treaty that would also regulate production and consumption of plastics.
Right. Speaking of reduction of consumption and production and postponement, Let's go to Taiwan. Taiwan has recently decided to move its deadline on banning single-use plastics from 2030 to 2035. So that's more than a decade away. We spoke to Taiwan's representative to the Busan Plastics Conference, Zhu Zhilun, Taiwan's Ministry of Environment, to understand why.
我们原来在2018年有针对了像塑胶类的这个免洗餐具、吸管一次用的饮料杯。还有购物用的塑胶袋，我们4种有定分年的目标，我们希望在2030在能够14的场域能够这个禁止它使用那可是这个实务上来讲，这种环保的生活习惯建立是需要时间的。可是前几年遇到了疫情因为疫情的关系，有一些规定都暂时的先抛弃了而且变成说有很多的外带外送、外食等等
Nate, having spent a lot of time here in Taiwan and being an environmental consultant here, what do you make of this delay?
I think it's unprecedented that Taiwan was even trying to phase out single-use plastics by 2030. I remember when they passed that initially, and they did it quite differently than other countries. You know, typically, if you look at single-use utensil or single-use bag bans in the United States, they'll target all consumers equally. But Taiwan's single-use ban first began in public spaces, so universities, government facilities, large companies, and then it's sort of trickling down to others. So it's not surprising that they would run into challenges when they're trying to bring it to the wider population. You know, if you think about a night market in Taiwan, that's a lot of single-use plastics. So I think Taiwan is ambitious, and they're doing it in the right way. They've done that hard work of establishing extended producer responsibility and really strong recycling markets, and now it makes sense to tackle these hard to mitigate single-use plastics. I think a delay is fair and it's honest, and it can give companies and entrepreneurs more time to develop alternatives. I understand there's now a reusable cup program in Taipei and across the country, and I think that's a really great start, and hopefully it'll start changing habits.
Right. So, Irene, how much does banning single-use plastics really help in clearing up plastic pollution, or at least stemming it to a certain extent?
It's part of the regulatory mix that we need. I mean, Nate mentioned EPR. EPR is also a very important regulation to enhance waste management programs and to get additional funding going in order to have the right collection, sorting, and recycling systems. Bans are equally as important in that they can regulate the unnecessary plastics. And this is something I'd like to mention, is that not all plastics are made equal. And some types of plastics have a need in society, and we require them for modern life. What's important is that we improve the type of plastics that we work with or that we use, and rather regulate those that are unnecessary and that do not have a good potential of being recycled. So when we look at a lot of the single-use plastic types, they're often plastic types that are not easily recyclable. They have a very short lifespan. That means that they're used for less than a couple of hours and then thrown away. One of the reasons that we need a global agreement and a global treaty is that no country's borders are completely sealed. So bans at a national level, as much as they help in controlling the situation at the nation level, there is always, if the neighboring countries have different practices, then there's always the pressure of those same banned products coming in through a different route.
That's really interesting. Now, you both also brought up this whole idea of mindsets and habits, and I want you to listen to this. There are many factors that contribute to the plastics problem, from policy to manufacturing to consumer habits. Zhu Zhilong from Taiwan's Environment Ministry tells us why habits is one of the biggest obstacles to change.
这种要改变民众的消费行为，跟建立环保的生活习惯，不是只有靠法令而已，它需要考虑到它的这个，比如说技术因素，也就是我刚才所讲的替代材质够不够成熟它的成本是不是大家能够接受那观念的建立这个要跟大家沟通的，习惯的养成是需要时间的所以环境部不会因为塑胶公约今年没有谈成，我们就来延缓我们原定要推动的减塑的目标我们是希望更多的项目更全面的推展。
Nate, does raising consumer consciousness actually improve the problem, all other factors being equal?
It's interesting because from the Taiwan case, the reason that Taiwan has the strong recycling laws it does is because of intense protest. It was, after martial law ended, where community groups rallied and protested new landfills, new incinerators, and pressured the government to develop the strong recycling laws it has today. So in some ways, that consumer consciousness can drive legislation. And, clearly in many parts of the world, that's fallen off a little bit. We need that first, but it's not the only factor because we're not playing on a level playing field when it comes to plastics. They're subsidized in direct and indirect ways. They don't have to pay the full cost of their environmental impact. And instead, we force people into situations where they have to get the cheapest option when it in fact might be the most expensive, for the planet or for themselves. And a lot of that comes from consumer demand and consumer consciousness. We see now that, large textile companies have mandates to use recycled and reclaimed materials in clothing. And we're starting to see that, even in computers. So there is consumer demand for this. People are interested in zero waste and reducing their plastic, but they're not given many great options. So we kind of need government to help us with that.
I would love to add to what Nate just said. The example of seat belts. Like I remember growing up in Latin America and seat belts being not something that was used. And now I think you go pretty much around most of the countries in the world and seat belts are used because there was a fine introduced. And having that pressure that there's a cost to not using a seatbelt has pushed consumers or drivers that before wouldn't have used it to use it. You usually need a full generational shift to adopt new behaviors. And so what regulation allows is to create that additional pressure to accelerate that behavior change. And what's so interesting about this plastics problem is that we're really discussing an industrial transition. Like Nate well mentioned, plastics are currently subsidized, which make them very cheap. And part of what the treaty is also looking to do is that how can we have the right enabling factors to transition out of plastics into an alternatives market. And that will require financing, that will require having financial support to developing the alternatives that we need, to investing in reuse infrastructure, to investing in compostable materials, in order for those to be able to compete with plastics. And that's going to take time, that's going to take public investment, it's going to take private investment, and it's going to take legislation change at a global level.
Right, so that brings me to EPR, or extended producer responsibility, now making manufacturers at least partially responsible for what happens to their products at the end of their life cycles can result in better design and easier recycling. So once again, we asked Zhu Zhilong from Taiwan's Ministry of Environment to explain how that works in Taiwan.
那台湾其实在这个 EPR 已经执行了非常多年了我们这个透过于跟这个制造或输入业者来收取回收基金，那这个基金的用途可以用在我们补贴这个材质的回收、处理跟循环再生的成本，我们可以提供经济诱因，让整个回收系统能够稳定的运作，同时来这个透过绿色费率的这个诱导让生产者能够采取更环保的设计。我们从明年1月1号会实施比如说像我们有一些生活中常见的，比如说洗发精沐浴乳等等，它用的塑胶容器，它是要缴回收基金的。可是如果它用合格的比例超过25%的这个回收料所制成那这样子我们的回收基金就允许它可以打85折。比如说我们塑胶瓶，它如果能够做到像铝罐那样，瓶盖是留在瓶身，而不是分离的那这样子就不会散落在环境那这样子我们也可以来回收基金打折。
So Nate, EPR includes economic incentives for manufacturers, consumers, and recyclers. How does Taiwan's model compare to what we're seeing internationally?
If you look globally, any country with a high recycling rate has strong extended producer responsibility laws. They also have bans on certain materials that go to landfill. And I'm speaking here, about Europe, EU, UK, but also Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. They've all followed the same development pathway on reducing their waste production, and it's worked. And not only has it worked, it's created strong economic incentives. And the other point here also to say is that in the case of Taiwan, recycling is effectively free, where you have to pay for your trash. And so that means that manufacturers are further incentivized to make sure that their packaging is recyclable, because why would you buy a bunch of packaging that you have to pay to throw away again? You know, people are price conscious and they pay attention to those things.
And speaking of recycling, for many of us, the feeling of responsibility for the waste we generate ends at the trash can marked recyclables. But that's just the beginning of the process, and a lot of our plastic never actually make it to proper recycling facilities. We spoke to Malaysian chemist and activist Puah Lay Peng, who reveals the surprising fate of plastic waste from many developed economies. Take a listen.
It was the smells that first alerted the residents of Genjarom that something was not right in their neighborhood.
We feel that the air getting worse, and then more people fell sick. So there's rumor saying that people from China cooking plastic surrounding our area. So as a chemist, I feel very strange why people want to cook plastic. The moment of the time, I have totally no idea about import plastic waste.
Chemist turned activist Puah Lay Peng, along with her community, have been fighting against illegal plastic recycling facilities in Genjarom since 2018. The town in Kuala Langat district is located 25 kilometers away from Malaysia's busiest port.
Surrounding my community, they have more than 30 this type of plastic recycle factory. We found land with 17,000 tons of waste from Europe, Australia, Japan, Korea, UK, of course, France, and then USA.
The community formed the Kuala Langat Environmental Action Association and filed a complaint with the local government. But Puah says after 6 months of inaction, they took matters into their own hands. They reached out to non-governmental groups like Greenpeace with footage of the area, which helped draw media attention.
A lot of international journalists, reporters came to us, CNN, BBC. I realized that we are the first community stood up to fight against plastic recycle factory, which for past 20 years, the waste sent to China, but now came to Malaysia.
China banned imports of plastic waste and other materials in 2018, but it has resulted in a surge of waste imports in other parts of the continent. In 2019, Puah and her community managed to get the government to clamp down on some recycling facilities. But Puah says many of the closures were short-lived, despite tighter regulations.
I think around 2 years ago, we start to find it come back already.
According to a 2024 UN report, Southeast Asian states import more than 100 million tons of metal, paper, and plastic waste annually, with Malaysia as one of the largest net importers.
For past more than 20 years, developed country, they are so get used to take developing country as their part of their waste management system, which is very unfair and is very unethical. We are part of the problem. This is a global problem.
For the full version of our conversation with Puah Lay Peng, please visit our YouTube channel or the TaiwanPlus website. Nate, let's talk about corporations now and what their responsibility is and how easy it is or how possible it is for them to take responsibility, because at the end of the day, that's where a huge amount of that plastic originates and then ends up as pollution.
Yeah, it really depends on what sector the corporate is in. In recent years, Coke has made a claim that for every bottle of Coke that they sell, they're going to recycle one bottle. In reality, that's extremely difficult to do because recycling markets are opaque and challenging. You know, thinking about that clip in Malaysia, you might think that you're selling your plastics to a reputable recycler. They might pass it on to someone who's doing something less ethical than that. If we think about other industries, textiles, you know, a lot of fast fashion today, they are essentially selling textile composite fabrics. You might be buying something that's stretchy. Well, that's going to have plastics inside of it, and that's going to make it very difficult to recycle those clothes. What's keeping them accountable is often the consumer. So I used to work at an NGO that did plastic footprints. I think Irene might be able to talk about this as well. And we worked with a cosmetics brand. We did a plastic footprint analysis, and it turned out that their cosmetics had plastic glitter inside of it. Now, the customers thought this glitter was natural, so it caused this huge backlash. So corporates have to be kind of careful because plastics are emotionally charged, and it's not like a carbon offset. Carbon dioxide goes into our shared atmosphere. We can kind of confidently say if we reduce carbon somewhere, well, there's challenges to that, but if you reduce carbon somewhere, you can kind of make a dent to the whole atmosphere. Plastics are different. There's many different types of plastics. They might not all end up in the environment, and their effects are really hard to mitigate, as we saw in that story. So ultimately, it is unfortunately up to consumers, legislators, to put that pressure and demand alternatives.
And Irene, we're running out of time here, but last word for you. Can you tell us what's next, or what's the next step that really realistically can be taken so that we are on our way to tackling this issue of plastic pollution?
Definitely. I would again like to bring a note of hope, is that around the world, consumers and also companies are not waiting for a treaty to take action. At Busan, we also saw the Business Coalition for a Plastics Treaty that unites I don't know how many of the world's biggest brands. And they are also calling for global rules because it helps also their business if there's a level playing field and that they are working against the similar sort of set of regulations globally. And countries are also not waiting for a global treaty to adopt national legislation. So the change is there. We see progress. What a treaty could bring is acceleration and an equal playing field at the global level. So I'm hopeful that next year, in the next round of negotiations, we are able to achieve something.
Irene Hofmeijer, thank you so much for the work you do, Irene's with Earth Action, and speaking to us from Amsterdam. Thank you for being on the program. And Nate, as always, great to have you on the show. And for our viewers everywhere, it's been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, do join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.